We are going to explore three things today. There we go. The first is really just looking at this whole idea of why resiliency matters and really what it is, how your thinking influences your sense of life balance and resiliency, and how you can ultimately build more resiliency in your life. And so as we go through today, there may likely be some things that you see for yourself in a new or perhaps expanded way, or maybe you just have some insights. And when we have those moments of new self-awareness, they can often be lost as quickly as they came. So I encourage you, whether you have a piece of paper in front of you or you're...
The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Okay, so I encourage you to jot down things that come up for you throughout our time together today so you can refer back to it later and reconnect with whatever might open up for you here. So let's start with exploring why resiliency matters. But first, it's important to define what resiliency is. And resiliency is really simply being able to thrive in the face of uncertainty and change, and to come back stronger in the face of adversity. So this is why resiliency matters, because who doesn't want to thrive in the face of uncertainty and change, because we know in life the only certainty besides death and taxes is change. And so we want to be able to navigate that and move in with ease and grace. With that, looking at these two diagrams, imagine that these two figures represent three-tier wedding cakes. And at the top of each cake are the outcomes that you are wanting to achieve in life, or maybe that your organizations are wanting to achieve, etc. There are really two parts of ourselves that contribute to our individual and your organization's outcomes. There's your work side and your self side, or your world side. So the work or world side is you out there as a human doing, and the self side is really kind of more you as a human being, if you will. If your mission was to get that cake in one piece to $1 million wedding, which cake would you ultimately want to be responsible for? My guess is that you all just picked figure A on the left. And why? Because it's more stable. It has a better base. And if you notice what that base is, it's the self side. Yet we are so conditioned in this country to sacrifice ourselves at any cost, and we think we are helping. We will sacrifice sleep, our own exercise, hobbies, our children's events, and more to work more hours, do things for others, take on a volunteer project, continuing to add things onto our plates. We think we are doing good, but my question to you is, how long can you continue like figure B before you run out of energy and your cake basically topples over? We can operate like figure B in the short run, but in the long run it's not sustainable. And sadly, research has found that only 7% of the population has a wedding cake, if you will, that looks like figure A. Your self side, your well-being matters hugely. And if you keep depleting yourself, you won't have the energy to enjoy the people and the things that matter to you in your life in order so that you can thrive in the face of uncertainty, change, and challenges. So if you're looking at this thinking that your cake looks like figure B, just know you're not alone. You're in company with about 93% of the population according to the research. And we need to realize this idea that we are human beings, not human doings. We are not computers. Even computers will crash at some point. If you think about a laptop computer, if you don't have it plugged in and you're running off its battery source and you turn it on beginning of the day, it's running at full power, full capacity, but what happens over the course of the day? That battery slowly kind of depletes, right? So the computer is going to start running more slowly. Maybe the screen is going to get dimmer. The performance is going to decline until you plug it in and recharge it. And so in one respect, I guess we are like laptop computers in that we do need that recharging. But we're obviously much more complex than that. And why should we care about this whole notion of energy? Because energy is defined as the capacity to do work. So if you think about the middle tier of that wedding cake, it's the work side or the world side. It's us doing work, getting things done out in the world. And so the more energy we have, the greater capacity we have to do work. So let's look at this from another example. Let's take an example of the first person on the left that you see, this kind of crabby-looking person. This is person is the typical person whose wedding cake looks more like figure B, that one that was on the right. This person is working 10-hour days in a typical 5-day work week, working through lunches, not taking breaks. And so kind of like that laptop computer, over the course of the day, this person's energy gets depleted. So they're averaging more around 60% capacity. And so if you do the math, in a typical 5-day work week, while this person is physically putting in 50 hours, they're really maybe only contributing about 30 hours of good quality work because they simply don't have the capacity. The second person here over on the right is the typical person whose wedding cake looks more like figure A. This person is working a more sane 8-hour workday, taking breaks on lunches, and renewing his or her energy throughout the day. And so in a 5-day work week, as you see here, this person still is not going to be at 100% capacity, right? But this person is more like 80% capacity. And so what happens is that although this person is putting physically in 10 fewer hours than the person on the left, they're actually producing 2 additional hours worth of work. And so they also then have those 10 additional hours available to tend to their personal well-being, or that self side of the wedding cake. So I ask you, which one makes more sense, right? The person on the right not only is contributing more work, has more energy, but has more time available to tend to the things that matter to him or her. And the work that Tony Schwartz has done with the Energy Project looks at this whole idea of energy and capacity. And they believe that burnout is the main driver behind employee engagement or disengagement in this country. And they have actually found that 76% of employees are currently experiencing what they call a personal energy crisis. And this is not sustainable. So we cannot keep operating like that wedding cake on the right-hand side. So one way to gain a quick snapshot of how you're doing in terms of balancing the different aspects of your life is something called the Life Balance Wheel. This is something that we use a lot in coaching, and it can be really very telling. And so you see here that there are multiple areas of well-being that make up the wheel. And if you were just to imagine for each segment that the center of the wheel is 0, or your lowest possible satisfaction with that area, and the outer ring is 10, or your best possible satisfaction. What we do is we ask people to draw a new arc that represents where you are in each section in terms of your satisfaction, and then we actually have them write a number by it. This example doesn't have the numbers, but you're basically drawing a new perimeter for the wheel. So in this example, if you look over on finances, if I was about halfway satisfied with my finances, I'd draw a new arc halfway through like it is here, and then I would have written a 5 by it. And the premise behind drawing this new perimeter and this life balance wheel is that if you think about a wheel, right, on a car, on a bike, on a stroller, on any kind of vehicle that is trying to move you forward to get wherever your destination is, the more rounded and large and full that wheel is, the more circular, the greater ease it will move forward. And a wheel that looks more like this example here, or kind of this amoeba, is also going to move forward, but it's probably going to be a more bumpy ride. And so in a really quick snapshot, you can see, how am I doing? Right? And you probably have a sense of it. And a lot of times when we think of health coaching, we think of health, we tend to just focus on that upper right sliver of health and well-being, not realizing there's so many other facets to us that ultimately make up that self side of our wedding cake. Let's look at an example of this life balance wheel in action. This is an example of one coaching client, and look at the difference in just 3 months, and she felt the benefit of this profound shift. And what's interesting about this is, I'm just going to take a couple examples. So if you look, for example, at the significant other on the lower left, I want to say she rated that around a 2 or so, and she didn't have a significant other. Well, 3 months later, that was a 7 or an 8, and it wasn't that she suddenly was in a relationship. She still wasn't, but what she said was different is, I'm okay with it. My thinking about where I'm at with this is okay. I'm totally fine right now at this stage of my life not having that kind of relationship for now. Fun and recreation, again, she rated it a 1 or 2 and said, I'm not taking the time to go to concerts and plays and do all these fun things, this idea she had in her head about what fun should look like. And 3 months later, she still wasn't doing those things, but she said, you know what I realized? I actually have a lot of fun in my life. I bring fun into my work. I bring fun into all kinds of things I do. I just wasn't really realizing it, and I wasn't appreciating it, that I love life and I have fun with kind of whatever I do. It doesn't have to be a big, grandiose event. With finances, again, you look at the difference between the left and the right. It wasn't that her finances suddenly got better. They still weren't where she wanted them to be, but she was appreciative of the fact that she was working a plan that she felt good about, and it was at least moving in the right direction. So I could go on and on for each one of these segments, but the main thing is what was different. It was her thinking about these areas and how she viewed each of these. That was the big difference. Her perspective shifted, or how she sees things. And so that's really critical as we continue on and look at this whole idea of the role of perspective and thinking and how that ultimately relates to life balance and being resilient. There's something we call the frame in terms of how we view things. And so we start in the upper left-hand quadrant here with how we see things. So this is our attitude or our perceptions, and this can be how we see ourselves, how we see other people, how we see a situation. So how we see or view things ultimately influences how we feel about it. And how we feel about it influences what we do, or our actions, the choices that we make. And what we do gets us some kind of result, some kind of outcome, and that result or outcome, what we get, ultimately reinforces how we saw it in the first place. So I'm going to use two examples that I frequently use for this. So let's say, in this first example, that I'm going for a walk on a beautiful fall day like today, and I look over in the woods, and I see a snarly-toothed tiger who looks pretty angry. How am I likely going to feel? Probably scared. And if I'm scared, what am I likely going to do? I'm probably going to run like there's no tomorrow. And if I run, what am I going to get? I'm going to get some kind of result, maybe out of breath, maybe an adrenaline rush, maybe a sense of relief of, whew, that was close. All of those things reinforcing what I saw, which is holy moly, I cannot believe that there was a tiger in the woods. Now, on the other hand, let's say I'm going for a walk. I look over in those same woods, but I don't see a tiger. I see a cardboard cutout of Tony the tiger. I'm probably going to feel very different. Probably not going to be scared for my life. I might be confused, indifferent, amused, perplexed, but instead of running, which was my do in the first example, I'm going to do something different. I might just keep walking. I might go up to it, but I'm probably not going to run for my life. And so I'm going to get a very different kind of result or outcome that's going to reinforce, I wonder why that cardboard cutout was sitting there in the first place. The point being, in either of these examples, I am completely justified in my do, in what I did, in my actions, based on how I saw the situation. Of course, if I saw a tiger, I'm going to run for my life. And of course, if I saw a cardboard cutout, why would I run for my life? And the point is that our typical approach is to jump to the do and try to change behaviors. But behaviors are really a manifestation of our underlying thinking, of how we see things. So unless we focus on building a solid foundation, the base of that wedding cake, that entire life balance wheel, by first looking at how we see things and then shifting our perspective, we will continue to fall back on habitual behaviors. And many of those habitual behaviors perpetuate our sense of stress, not having time, not being resilient, etc. Lasting change, however, does not come from simply doing things differently. It comes from seeing things differently. Trying to do differently without thinking differently is pretty much doomed to fail, because we are on autopilot the majority of the time. So with that in mind, let's take a little closer look at this idea of how we see things. Every moment of every day, we are basically at this starting point where our thinking can go down one of two paths. In other words, our frame can see a tiger or a cardboard cutout of a tiger based on which path we choose. The first automatic path is the judger path, and it leads us to an inherent need to be right and therefore more blame-focused. Blame ourselves, why did I eat that? Why didn't I do that? Blaming other people, blaming our circumstances. And if we stay on this path too long, we start kind of looking for all the things that are wrong, very problem-focused, and we end up in this really sad judger pit of doom, or as my psychologist mother calls this, stinkin' thinkin'. And again, this path is very automatic, it's very reactionary, win-lose, blame-focused, problem-focused. This is when our thinking is not necessarily serving us very well. The other path that we can go on with our thinking is a more thoughtful, choiceful, and intentional path that's called the learner path, where we have almost a childlike curiosity about ourselves. We also have that curiosity about others and the world around us. So on this path, we start asking questions. What else happened here? What else might be going on here? What am I wanting here? What could I learn? What else might this person be experiencing? The list goes on and on and on. On this path, we recognize that there is far more than just what we see or what is apparent to us. And so when we are on a learner path, we are more solution-focused, we're more choiceful, more thoughtful, and it's more of a win-win relating. The beauty is that if we can start to recognize when we're on the judger path, we can get off of it. We can course correct at any time by simply asking learner questions, and we can move to a place where our thinking is serving us a little bit better. Let's look at this another way. How I see things can be framed in terms of what's known as the line. So imagine this line here kind of falls between that learner path and that judger path. I can be above the line in my thinking, and when I'm above the line, people start to report things like they feel like they have more energy, they're more positive, they feel like they're in the driver's seat of their life, they're more patient, they're more empathetic, they're kinder, the list goes on and on. On the other hand, when I'm below the line, people tend to report things like they feel more negative and pessimistic, they have lower energy, they're impatient, they feel like they're a victim of circumstance, those types of things. So another way to think about this is that below the line is more like that judger thinking we just talked about, or when your thinking's not serving you well. And above the line is more like that learner thinking, or when your thinking is serving you well. And so when we start to really be aware of kind of where we're at, we can go, is my thinking above the line or below the line? Is it serving me well or not? Another way that we can view this is maybe we don't pay attention to ourselves, but pay attention to people around you. How are other people showing up for you, right? So when I'm above the line, people are fascinating to me. They're interesting to me. I'll say a lot of times, you know, when I'm above the line, my husband is my best friend. He's funny. He's a great dad. He's helpful. The list goes on and on and on. When I'm below the line, he's annoying, he's lazy, he makes me do all the work, and the list goes on and on. My point here is I'm not married to two people. And it's really how I'm viewing him is really where my thinking is that day. And so if people are on my last nerve, it's a sign for me to check in and go, hold on, where's my thinking today? And if I can recognize that I've visited below the line, then there are things in my life that can act like a trampoline, that can almost help me spring back above the line. So maybe it's listening to certain music, or getting out in nature, or looking at a picture of someone I care about, or listening to a funny video clip, those types of things. So we all have these resources that we can tap into that can kind of act like that trampoline, but we first have to recognize that our thinking has gone below the line. And if we can't spring back above the line, if it's one of those days that I didn't get enough sleep, I'm not feeling well, I was stuck in traffic, and the list just goes on and on and on, then the best thing that I can do is to go below the line that day in a bubble. And what I mean by that is, you know what, I try not to infect the people around me. It doesn't give me a pass to be a jerk to people, but I might, for example, say to my coworkers, I'm having a below the line, or I'm just not having a good day. And so instead of them wondering, what's wrong with Rosie? She's not talking to me today, blah, 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 they kind of go, okay, I'm going to give her space. Or maybe I go home and say to my loved ones, you know what, this is not a good day. I'm going to kind of go be a hermit, because I know that what comes out of my mouth is probably not coming from my best thinking, and I don't want to have collateral damage that I now have to pick up the pieces later. So the more that we can be aware of when our thinking is and isn't serving us, we can get off this autopilot mode of doing things that really don't serve our well-being very well. And the more that we can engage in better thinking, that learner or above the line thinking, the more we can fully experience our lives. And so in those moments of decision making, what we know is not enough. We have to be able to call on more and what we know about ourselves and what we want for ourselves. So when we can build that self side of our wedding cake, that includes knowing ourselves at a different level and being able to be the full expression of our full potential, of what matters to us, not what we think we need to do to meet some external idea. So we can look in the mirror, so to speak, like this wonderful photo here of little Billy Williams, and have some new insights and excitement that help us move forward on our well-being journey. But the reality is that we know that we are creatures of habit. However, it's very easy for stubborn habitual thinking to lead to being stuck in a rut. And so we have to look at our thinking, is the way we've always done things, does it make sense anymore? Who I am today is not the same person I was a year ago. It's not even the same as I was a week ago because life is ever changing. It's a journey, and we don't know where it's going to go. It throws us curveballs and detours. So we have to be able to adapt. So the more we dig our heels in and are stuck in ways of doing things, especially when they don't serve us, we start to have stress and we start to have angst. But we can move beyond that when we can be curious and have that childlike mindset and say, hold on, is this serving me anymore? Does this even make sense today? How else could I see this? How else could I look at this? Because as human beings, we are programmed for continuous learning and growth. And so you can ask yourself today if some of your habits are serving you well, and if they're not working, how could you maybe start to look at them in a different way? There's a great saying that says the only difference between a rut and a grave is the depth of the excavation. And I think that there's a lot of truth to that. In keeping the frame and the line in mind that we just talked about, what is it that allows some people to really thrive in life while other people struggle? Well, the research has found that the top 20% of people, those who are thriving in life, are more on the learner path. You know, they tend to live on the learner path or above the line, but it doesn't mean that they never go on the judger path or they never go below the line. The difference is they recognize when they're down there, and then they use those resources that act like a trampoline to get themselves back above the line or back on that learner path. They ask those questions. And it's, again, they do go down there, they recognize when it's there, and they try to get above it. And if they cannot get their thinking back into a good spot, they go in that protective bubble. On the other hand, bottom 80 people don't recognize when their thinking isn't serving them, and they continue to focus on trying to do differently, never pausing and saying, am I really seeing a tiger, or maybe this is just a cardboard cutout? I'm going to give you one more way to look at this. There's something that is to be considered when we're below the line or on that judger path. So when I'm below the line or on that judger path, I enter something that's called a self-deception box. And what happens in this box, it's called self-deception for a reason, right, is our brains kind of trick ourselves to not have this dissonance and to really justify how we see things. So when I'm in this self-deception box, what happens is I tend to start to inflate my own good qualities. And I start to see myself as this martyr and victim, and I'm patient, and I'm doing good things, and I'm the good one here. And at the same time as I'm doing that, I also inflate other people's not so good qualities. And by doing this, I start to justify how I see things and justify very likely being below the line or on that judger path. And so what happens then? When you're in this self-deception box, you cannot focus on results. You cannot be solution-focused. And what is interesting is that our influence and success in life, achieving those outcomes we're wanting, depends on us not being in this box. And so how we get out of this box is we cease resisting other people. We start shifting our own thinking and start to be more mindful and choiceful from moment to moment. We stop resisting ourselves. We start opening up that childlike curiosity. Let me give you a concrete example of this, so this might make a little bit more sense. So this is an example of what happens when we get in our self-deception box. So I'm going to pretend that Bob is somebody that I supervise, but you could insert that, maybe it's your significant other, maybe it's your child, maybe it's your parent, maybe it's a coworker. So insert whoever you want in place of Bob for the purposes of this example. And so I start with what Bob does, because we tend to react to people's behaviors. So Bob, in this example, does not complete a project on time. That's it. That's what he does. And so what do I see based on this? I start to see that he's irresponsible, he's disrespectful, he's distracted, and he's lazy. So where do I go? Hello, self-deception box. And I'm now in it big time. And because this is what I see for Bob, what do I start to do? I start disciplining him, criticizing, micromanaging. I stop giving him projects altogether, because why would I if he's not going to get it done on time? And so based on what I do, what does Bob see? Well, he's going into his box now about me. So he's going to inflate his good qualities and inflate my bad qualities. And so now that Bob is in his box, what does he see? I am the boss from you-know-where. And he's in his box, and we have this very vicious, unproductive cycle. So how often does this happen in romantic relationships and parent-child and friendships, right? So we jump to, I saw he didn't complete this on time, and I made it mean all of these horrible things. But if I could just pause and choose to be curious and see things differently, just based off the simple example that he didn't complete something on time. Well, one possible way to see it is certainly that he is irresponsible and all these things. Another way is, I hope something isn't going on with him with his self-side of his wedding cake. I hope that he's not struggling with something in his personal life. Or, I wonder if maybe something wasn't clear. I wonder if some extenuating circumstances happen. All of a sudden, when I go into that curious place, it's, and I'm open to listening to him and having a dialogue versus assuming the worst and then having this vicious cycle. And if he knows that I'm going to always jump to the worst conclusion, he's going to shut down. And when you have two shut down people, we don't get anywhere. And so just by pausing and seeing things differently, we could potentially avoid this whole fiasco. And this is at the root of so many communication problems, both personally and professionally. So let's continue to look at resiliency and life balance in terms of how we see things, because this is so important. So there's what happened. And so this could be, in this previous example, Bob didn't complete a project on time, but it could be you were late for work. It could be so-and-so canceled on you. I mean, the list can go on and on. So we have something happened, and then over here we have this huge story about what happened. And the problem is that we start to live as if our story about what happened is what actually happened, rather than seeing that it's just how we interpreted what happened and how we're seeing what happened. And so what happened starts to go away, and we're left with just this huge, big story. And many times that story is filled with a lot of extra drama and unnecessary suffering. But there's tremendous power in recognizing that it really is just our story, and there's also tremendous power in changing our story or changing how we see things. I don't know if you're familiar with Viktor Frankl, but he was a neurologist and a psychiatrist from Vienna, Austria. And during World War II, he spent 3 years in various concentration camps. And in the mid-1940s, he wrote this book called Man's Search for Meaning. And it chronicled his experiences as an Auschwitz concentration camp inmate during World War II. And he had this psychotherapeutic method that he used, which worked with people in identifying this purpose that they had in life to feel positively about, and then really kind of let them be immersed in imagining that outcome. And what Viktor Frankl concluded from his whole experience is that these concentration camp prisoners' psychological reactions were not solely the result of the conditions of their lives, and these were horrible conditions. But their psychological experience, how they felt, was based on the freedom of choice that people have, even in the face of severe suffering. So life can throw you curveball after curveball after curveball, but misery is really a choice. Suffering is a choice. And so the choice to see things in a way that serves you well or not is the huge difference. And what he found is that when prisoners lost hope, or in another way were stuck on that judger path, they were doomed. And so I love this quote from him because it really speaks to so many things. And so for the purposes of today, it's really shifting our perspective and how we see things to find a greater sense of balance and build resiliency. And it really speaks to this other quote from him as well, that, between kind of what happens in our response, there's a space. What Bob did was not complete a project on time. Well, there's a space before I respond. And it's really, I have the power to choose how I'm going to respond and how I'm going to see it. But we have to first pause and get off autopilot. Now, having said all of that, let's take a look at how we can take this awareness of thinking, of our story, of all these things we've been talking about, and bring forward better thinking to help us build more resiliency. Let's go back to those top 20 people for a moment. And one of the other key characteristics, besides the fact that they recognize when their thinking isn't serving them well, is that they are resilient. And so these are some characteristics of resilient people. And resiliency is something you can learn, and I'll talk more about that in a moment. But resilient people don't sweat the small stuff. They're not going to give their attention to something that really isn't going to matter in the long run. They are able to be at their best and maintain a sense of balance when they're faced with pretty big stuff or major challenges. They're also flexible but very durable and have a better ability to go with the flow. And at the end of the day, they come back stronger in the face of adversity. So I invite you to think of someone who just lights up a room and has that something about them that you want to be around. Most likely that person is resilient when you're just in awe of all they've been through and you're like, wow, how do they do it? For me, someone who immediately comes to mind as the epitome of resilience is Nelson Mandela. And just thinking about all he went through, yet all he was able to accomplish and be by shifting his story and how he saw things. So let's look at how we can become a little more resilient, because we know it can be learned, but it takes practice. And it takes a commitment to shifting our way of being and our habitual ways of doing things, of getting out of those ruts. The first thing is putting things into perspective. So think to yourself, okay, is this going to still be a big deal tomorrow? And if your answer is yes, then say, okay, well, it'll still be a big deal a week from now. And if your answer is yes, okay, how about a month from now, 6 months from now, etc. And it allows you to kind of say, is this really the small stuff that I'm sweating, or is this a big thing that really deserves my attention? And so you don't want to give things or situations unnecessary attention or worry. So putting things in perspective really allows you to make that determination of how much of your energy is worth providing to them. Be mindful of what comes out of your mouth is another one. We know that the mind and the body are really powerfully connected. For example, there's a really phenomenal case study in the psychiatric literature about a man who had this terrible problem with being a kleptomaniac or shoplifting. And he tried everything but couldn't stop. So he ended up going to this psychiatrist who specializes in hypnosis. And the psychiatrist hypnotized the man and basically said that the next time you go to try to steal something, you won't be able to complete the act because your hand will freeze in midair. So the next day, in the middle of July, the psychiatrist received a strange phone call from a convenience store manager who happened to find his business card in this man's pocket. And they were totally perplexed because this man had severe frostbite in the middle of summer. His mind literally froze his hand. That's how powerfully connected the mind and the body are. So if you tell yourself, this is going to be hard, this sucks, I'm doomed, I'll never be able to do it, how do you think your body's going to react? And so you can change that script and kind of set a different intention and live into that. Practicing acts of gratitude, it can be really easy to get caught up in all that isn't right in our world or all that could go wrong, kind of that runaway worry. But for example, let's say we almost got in a car accident. We can choose to be thankful for being spared versus dwelling on what could have happened. That's just a simple example. And even on the worst days where life is just not going our way and we're stuck below the line, we can find 3 to 5 things we're thankful for. Maybe we're thankful for having heat and running water and clothes on our back. It's as basic as that, but it can help you really be grateful for what you do have. Living in the present moment is another one. When we can be present and be mindful, it's really, truly one of the best ways to build resiliency because you're living life as it unfolds, right? You're on the journey versus fast forward to some destination trying to make it happen when that's not how the road is going to go. I don't know if you saw the movie Pay It Forward, but it's a great movie, and you want to talk about the benefit of just doing nice things for people and not expecting anything in return, because expectation leads to disappointment. But there's a lot of good literature to say when we can just start doing small things for people, it really helps us build resiliency in return. Another one that maybe is easier said than done is stop settling. The reality is that we train the world how to treat us. So if you keep settling for things rather than advocating for what you want for yourself and what really matters to you, it can become really easy to get caught up in all of the struggles and the challenges rather than viewing them as opportunities. And finally, giving ourselves a break. Perfection is really a myth, so the more that we can appreciate our own humanity and embrace that we are all works in progress, it becomes a little easier to find balance and adapt to the curveballs that life throws at us. And it also means taking time to replenish our well and energy and tend to the self side of our wedding cake, knowing that I got to give myself a break, I can't keep going. It's really important with all of this then to look at who's really running your life. There are kind of two aspects of this. The first is what we call the core. And the core is our true self. It's our worth comes from who we are as a human being, not from our work or our degrees or our health status or anything like that. This is really what we are wanting for ourselves. This is us as a human being. And then out here we have the circumference. And out here is what we think we should be doing. And so we end up reacting to other people's opinions, other people's expectations, and other people's attitudes. And so on this circumference, there's that reacting to it, and it may be real or it may just be perceived, right? It's how we're seeing it. Maybe we're in our self-deception box. There's a lot of busyness going on here. This is us as a human doing. Imagine for a second about if you take a fish out of water and you put a fish in the bottom of the boat. What is that fish going to do? It's going to start violently flapping around because it's trying to figure out how to adapt to this environment that's totally foreign and not where it belongs. But if you take that fish and put it back in the water, even after it struggles, it very quickly finds its way and swims off with ease and grace. Well, the more that you are trying and struggling between your core and circumference, that your core is saying yes, but your circumference is saying no. Or your core is saying no, but your circumference is saying yes. The more that they are not aligned or at odds with each other, you're going to kind of feel like that fish in the bottom of the boat flopping around. Here's another way to look at this. If you imagine these two circles, think about a plate, right? You have that inner circle, which is your core, and you have the outer circle. You could, in theory, take one or two fingers in the center of that plate, in the center of the core, and you could start piling all kinds of stuff on that plate and still balance it. But you cannot take one or two fingers on the side of the circumference and balance that plate. It's not possible unless you had super glue on your fingers. It's going to fall over. And so the point here is that when we are living more as human doings, reacting to our environment, living from the outside in versus the inside out, that is where we have a whole lot of unnecessary suffering, a lot of stress, a lot of anxiety, a lot of guilt, a lot of resentment. But when we can live from the core, we have joy and satisfaction and happiness, and it more easily puts us on that learner path to look at what matters to us and kind of go from there. And so when we're hitting I should, that's a sign that we're on our circumference and isn't serving us well. So a really short motto to think about is don't should on me. You got to say that really carefully. Keeping that in mind, I want to share a story with you that speaks to having resiliency, not shoulding on you, and living with intention. Long ago, there was a man who every day came upon this beautiful fruit tree. And every day the wind would blow just enough where one or two pieces of fruit would fall. And the fruit was juicy and satisfying, and the man enjoyed it very much. And this continued day after day and week after week and month after month. This was his daily ritual. So this is kind of like when life is just humming along and going well, and perhaps we even take that for granted. Well, one day the man went to the tree, but the wind did not blow, and the fruit did not fall. And day after day, the same thing happened. No wind, no fruit. And eventually the man started to become extremely distraught, and he would kick and scream at the base of the tree and cry, "Why?" and "Why me?" and etc. And one day while he was doing this, a wise old man came along and witnessed him carrying on and having this fit. And the wise man asked him what the matter was, and this man started to explain how the wind stopped blowing, and he didn't have fruit, and he was hungry, and he was thirsty, and all these types of things, and wah, wah, wah. And the wise old man just looked at him and said in a pretty matter-of-fact way, "Well, why don't you just get up and shake the tree?" So I ask you, are you sitting around below the line on a judger path, or perhaps in your self-deception box, waiting for someone else to do or be differently, right? Or circumstances to change, or when that happens, then I'll start paying attention to the self side of my wedding cake, or whatever that might be. Someday I'll pay attention to it. Or are you in the driver's seat shaking your own tree and living with intention? Being able to be on the learner path and have resiliency and thrive in life requires us to be more choiceful, even in the face of adversity. Look at what Viktor Frankl learned from the concentration camp victims. We can always change our story. But we can't do that if we're not tending to ourselves, if we're not tending to that self side of our wedding cake or all segments of that life balance wheel. And so one of the best questions to help with living with intention and being resilient is to ask yourself this simple question: what am I wanting for myself in this moment? Given the circumstances, and that no matter how much I may wish it, I cannot change the situation and I cannot change other people, what am I wanting for myself inside of all of this? Right? And so we can look at this in multiple situations, and then we can focus more on that moment and then baby steps, right? So it doesn't have to be, I want it all now. What am I wanting more of in this moment? What will bring me a little more of that in this moment? And then make small incremental changes. And another thing that is incredibly helpful is asking for the support that you need. It can be very humbling to admit you can't do it all, but we really are only human. And so if you have a loved one, a friend, a coworker who's struggling, are you judging them, or are you reaching out to offer support? Recognizing that not everybody will ask for support on their own accord. We also need to give ourselves credit for even small changes, and all of these things that allow us to live with intention is what builds resiliency and lets us find balance no matter what life decides to throw our way. Living with intention will be challenging due to something we refer to in coaching as the gremlin. And the gremlin is the part of our brain and thinking that wants immediate gratification. It prefers the status quo, even when the status quo isn't serving us well and keeping us stuck in that rut. But the beauty of the gremlin is that once we become more aware of our thinking, it ceases to have the power and hold on us that it wants to, just by identifying it. And it only takes 3 or 4 seconds to pause. And we can ask ourselves, is this coming from my best thinking, or is this coming from my gremlin? And our best thinking is that answer to the question of what am I really wanting for myself? That's best thinking, the answer to that, when we pause and go, what is it? How else could I see this? What am I really wanting? And we let our mind quiet for a few seconds to hear something beyond this immediate judger gremlin. There's a really interesting story that illustrates all of this. There's a man that's pretty typical of a lot of us. So he's just racing through life and doing one thing after another, go, 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 right? And he's, always working and doing stuff and just busy, 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 a human doing, very much on that circumference. And he's going along one day, racing through a neighborhood, racing too fast, racing through life, and all of a sudden, boom, he gets stopped dead in his tracks. A brick hits his car. And he is not happy about this, and he gets out, and he looks, and he's furious, and he sees this young boy who's just in tears and saying, I'm sorry, mister, but my little brother over there, as you can see, he's in a wheelchair, and he's hurt, and he's fallen out of it, and I can't get him back in, and no one has been stopping me, and I didn't know how else to get anyone's attention. Maybe you just felt yourself go, oh, well, that's what this man did, and he was like, oh, my goodness. And so he went and helped this boy, and he's walking back with his head hanging down back to his car, and just that forced him to just stop and think what mattered in life, what was important. And he decided to keep that dent in his car as a reminder. Are we speeding through life so fast as a human doing with our wedding cake about to topple over that someone has to literally throw a brick at us before we stop and really look at what's important. And the gremlin can be so powerful that it does take someone practically hitting us with a brick before we do stop and pause and start to pay attention. Pay attention to ourselves as a human being, not a human doing. So as we wrap up today, I want to share one more story with you to illustrate this. So this cartoon here is if Wonder Woman was a Disney princess. And you see, oh dear, I'm afraid I've already slayed the dragon, defeated the evil queen, and saved the kingdom. But it's truly splendid you all offered to help. The reason why I love this cartoon and someone gave this to me is because this used to be me, racing along like the guy in the Jaguar. And actually, if I'm really truthful, it still is me. It's really hard to change our hardwiring and our thinking. However, now I'm very much aware that this is my tendency, and I've learned to manage it and be aware when my life balance wheel feels lopsided, when I feel my wedding cake is about to topple over, so that I can do something about it. But I invite you to imagine this being my mindset, or mindset, as I tell you a story of a brick that halted this Wonder Woman mentality. So this is what shook my tree and threw a brick at me. This is my son Peyton when he was about 7 or 8 months old. So imagine this smiling, happy, fun-loving baby and suddenly getting sick regularly, unexplained fevers, wicked high fevers lasting for days that started coming almost like clockwork with no explanation, right? No specialist can tell you what's wrong with your son. And Peyton is extremely resilient, so in between these episodes, you would never know anything was wrong with him. And so imagine this continuing, and he's about this age, and all of a sudden he's sick with another fever, and he suddenly goes limp, lifeless, unresponsive. Imagine the horror that you would feel thinking that your baby is dying before your eyes. And now imagine this happening numerous more times in the upcoming months. And again, no one can give you answers. Well, we finally, this is not a bad story, he's turning 4 next week, we finally learned that his problems were dietary, but this led to a whole new reality of learning all about how to shop, cook differently, prep him for school, social events, etc., and it changed our entire reality. And it took months and months of adjustment. For me, it also, though, required me to hang up my cape and ask for support. And it was probably one of the hardest, yet one of the best things I ever could have done. And I also remain keenly aware that if I don't continue to tend to me, to the south side of my wedding cake, and replenish my energy, I won't be any good for Peyton. And in watching him, I am keenly aware of some great lessons he has taught me in terms of living a balanced and resilient life. And again, I think kids are just really great about being on that learner path and teaching us something about resiliency. So what has this amazing 3-year-old, almost 4-year-old taught me? He's taught me that we can find our balance, resiliency, and really our inner strength to thrive in life when, first of all, we don't underestimate the power of simple things in life, that being present. And sometimes we just really do need to be present and stop and smell the flowers. And so we need to realize that life is constantly changing and is unpredictable. And just like with gymnasts, they aren't completely still on those balance beams. We have to be flexible. So balancing our wedding cake is not a one-time thing. It's about constant, subtle movements and adjustments, being able to say, given what life has thrown at me, what am I wanting and needing in this moment, this day, this week, right? We have to make those constant adjustments just like the gymnast on the balance beam. And we need to be able to tap into a better way of seeing things or be on that learner path if we're going to be able to find balance and thrive when life's challenges and uncertainty comes our way. We also need to recognize the power and value of supporting one another, because no gymnast succeeds in isolation, right? He or she are part of being a team where they can gain their strength. You have people around you. You have relationships personally and professionally. So are you reaching out to people to support them, or are you going in your box and judging them? In other words, as I said a little bit earlier, it's about making these subtle adjustments in life to do what's better, not perfect. And it takes a little time to build that, but it can be done. And so these are the things that we focus on supporting our coaching clients in, really in all of our tracks, but particularly in our Manager Stress and Build Resiliency track. So in all of our coaching tracks, we work with people to shift their perspective. And for the purposes of today, it's really shifting your perspective that allows you to get back in the driver's seat of life and create balance that works for you. So hopefully there was some things that opened up for you. You would love to answer any questions you have, or if there's anything that any of the participants want to share that opened up for you, we'd love to take that now and just thank you for being with us today.
Great, thank you, Rosie.
Yeah.
Let's see, we do have one question here. I seem to have trouble saying no to others. Any advice for me?
That's very common. Yeah, you know, I think I hear this all the time, and I think the best way I can answer that is, you know, it goes back to that core circumference of who's running your life. And I think the more that we really start to get really clear about what matters to us and who we are and what am I wanting for myself at the core, it really, truly, I know it sounds easier said than done, but it becomes easier to say no, because you start going, you know what, this doesn't really serve me. And people start to respect that, you know what, no, I'm not going to take on that project. And people, and myself, for example, there was a time when I said yes to everything. And when I started setting boundaries and realizing, no, my cake was going to topple over. Nope, this didn't serve me well. People start approaching me with a filter, and it doesn't mean they don't come to me with things, but they start kind of almost going, oh, I want to be respectful of Rosie. And so it's just very interesting. We kind of train the world how to treat us. And so I just think the more that we can be clear and live from the core versus circumference, it really, truly does become easier to say no and not have guilt, not have resentment, and all that other junk that goes with it.
All right, well, I'm not seeing any more questions, so at this time I want to thank you again for joining us for today's webinar. In closing, please remember to complete the webinar evaluation survey that you will receive via email. We would appreciate your feedback on today's presentation. Everyone who completes the